Could we welcome Joanna Dorman? She's a Principal Passenger Ships Standards Manager at the Marine and Coastguard Agency, and she's going to talk to us about vessel standards.
Good afternoon. My name's Jo Dorman. As has been said, I'm from the Maritime and Coastguard Agency, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the ship side of thing and the standards involved there. So to give you a bit of an overview and a picture of a collision, just because focus the mind, I'll do a bit of an introduction. I'll talk about prevention. I'll then move on to sort of structure of the ships in general, and then a little bit more on sort of scantling determination, post-damage survivability for when it's all gone really wrong, and then a sort of quick note on fendering and some closing thoughts. So first of all, about me, I'm a naval architect by training. And I work as a principal for passenger ships in the Maritime and Coastguard Agency. As we heard in our first presentation, the MCA is the sort of regulatory arm of the UK Flag Administration, and we work closely with, but not as part of, the MAIB, so we're entirely separate from them, and we work with the regulation and the control of shipping. Myself, I primarily deal with the UK domestic fleet. What I mean by that is ships that operate in UK waters and go from the UK back to the UK. So they're not on international voyages, and I deal with passenger ships. So I have a wide variety of vessels sort of on my books, as it were, right from, I think, I was looking up, I think the smallest one is about 7 metres long. It's our smallest seagoing passenger ship, and up to sort of larger ferries such as you might get in Scotland. Just as a note for anyone not from a maritime background, when I mean a passenger ship, from a regulatory point of view, that means there are over 12 passengers on board, just in case some of you might not be familiar with that. So, as an introduction to this presentation, I'm going to focus on inland waterways passenger ships. From a regulatory point of view, our inland waterways in the UK go from canals right out to an area such as the Solent. So the Solent isn't actually categorised as sea from the point of view of ship regulation, and we split those inland waterways up into different categories, starting with category A, which is the least onerous, which is basically shallow canals, moving out to category D, which is somewhere like the Solent. Talking specifically about collisions with fixed infrastructure such as piers, and not about collision with floating structures or other ships. The main collision modes here, obviously head-on collision and more of a side collision, a sort of glancing blow. It's also worth noting that we are kind of talking about two different types of collision. You've got uncontrolled collisions, which you didn't mean to happen at all, but in shipping we do in fact have an awful lot of controlled collisions. Whenever a ship comes alongside or moors up at a pier or jetty, it's still an interaction, and a controlled collision can move into a sort of an area where you don't want it to if you hit it too hard or you hit it in the wrong place, as we saw in the lovely video from the MAIB. That certainly wasn't a very controlled collision. So the best mitigation against collision, or sort of collisions that have gone wrong, is prevention, of course. Andrew's already spoken a little bit about some of the controls in place. I know Mark later will be talking about the sort of navigational regime on the Thames, but prevention through various means is really the best way to stop it happening. There are numerous navigational aspects with nautical charts, so make sure your obstructions are properly marked on there. Waterway controls, mechanisms such as Thames AIS can all be used to help against collisions. I haven't put it on there, but a very important one is the experience and training of the operator. It does all come down to the human interaction. We're not in an age of autonomous ships yet. So the experience and training of the operator is a key thing. I'll move on to the third point, visibility from the control position. I'm very glad that Jay showed you the video he did of the small workboat and the higher speed vessel, because that illustrates quite nicely what you can see from a control position and what you maybe can't. Some of those views there were from cameras and not from actually where the helmsman is. So a real key is all-round visibility and ability to see things from the control position, and that will help with the uncontrolled collisions against things you didn't mean to hit. But it's very obvious that all ships are going to have a certain amount of blind spots, and you'll never be able to see directly in front of a ship. It's often difficult to see sort of right down the side. So some of the other things that can be used are for close quarters manoeuvring, additional visual aids, additional cameras. We don't allow cameras and mirrors and visual aids as part of sort of all-round navigation, but we do allow them for specific kind of close quarters assistance. To go with the visibility, what we call situational awareness. It's all very well and good being able to see, but a key part of safe navigation is making sure that you've got a good all-round perception of what's going on around you, and that's looking at other vessels and knowing about where the infrastructure is and also how other vessels might behave. Visibility is sort of one half and situational awareness is the other. Maintenance of propulsion machinery and control systems. Obviously, one of the key things when you're coming up to a pier is your speed and being able to control your speed. Perhaps coming in at an appropriate speed is very important. I was talking to a ship operator just the other day. He said the most important thing about collisions is don't come into things too fast. I thought, well, that is a key point. But what you also don't want to happen is you don't want to be coming in and then for something to fail and cause a collision. I think one of the MAIB cases pretty much dealt with exactly that. There was a failure, obviously without sort of saying what might have caused it, but a propulsion failure can lead to uncontrolled contact with the quayside in a manner that you didn't want. So it's very important to maintain those systems, make sure they're operating well, and make sure you've got sufficient redundancy of systems. So moving on to the vessel itself, the sort of fundamental fabric of the vessel, its structure, what it's made up of. We at the MCA, we don't actually produce technical standards for hull structure of ships. That might come as a surprise. We do have regulations, and we do sort of produce regulations, but the actual sort of scantlings and the dimensions of the structure is not something that we do. So for a new passenger ship, we require that they're designed in accordance with classification society rules. Classification societies, by which I mean sort of Lloyd's Register, Det Norske Veritas, Spanish Lloyd, and sort of other societies like that. That's actually the same across international regulations as well. SOLAS, which we've talked about before, doesn't deal in the detail of structural requirements for ships. It just requires them to have a structure in accordance with to the satisfaction of the administration, which in principle means it's done to the rules of a recognised organisation. So the detailed requirements are all within the Classification Society rules. There are rules for all sorts of different applications, and not just ships in fact, but thinking particularly about passenger ships, there are inland waterways rules, there are rules for high speed and light craft, there are rules for special service craft, which might be more sort of, different things. High speed and light craft, obviously you're going to come out with a lighter structure than that for a sort of traditional inland waterways boat. It's worth noting here though that structural requirements and sort of the requirement to be classed isn't necessarily retrospective. We have a lot of older vessels on our books, and an older passenger ship might not be classed, and also if it is, it might be to a completely different rule set to the rules of today. In general, sort of older rules tend to come out with sort of less optimised, thicker structures, because it goes all the way back to when it was kind of almost more of a rule of thumb. But as sort of engineering analysis has moved on, structures become more and more optimised. But it is just worth noting that. Scantling determination. What I mean by that is what does the thickness of the plating need to be, what do the stiffeners need to be. That's what we refer to as the ship's scantlings. That's done according to calculations against the rules. I was going to show you some pictures of class rules calculations, but they're just formulae really, and quite often you'll have a great long formulae, and you'll get to the bottom of it. You'll have worked out that you need 2.5 mil plate, and it will say not to be less than 3. So there's always sort of minimum. You can find yourself doing quite a lot of calculation and ending up just going back to the minimum number. The rules obviously vary for build material. The principal build materials for our passenger ships, obviously steel, aluminium, GRP, and for some of the older vessels, wood. There are rules for wooden ships. It's obviously quite a different sort of form of calculation. You need to look at the plating thickness, which will vary according to where you are on the ship, the framing of the ship, how it's put together, how it's stiffened, and there are different requirements for different areas according to structural load. A sort of an easy way to think about that is to think of an ice-breaking ship, which will have a sort of belt of strengthening called the ice belt, where it would interact with the ice. So that's a sort of key way to think about how the structure might vary. Bit of example structure here. This is the sort of fore end of a vessel. Going back to the collision bulkhead, you can see you've got plates, stiffened plates, you've got sort of additional strengthening, and you've got a nice structural stem there. So that's the sort of fore end of a ship, and that's a sort of typical what it might look like. When thinking about the structure of ships, you'll notice that it all seems quite sort of basic. We're talking plates and stiffened plates. Thinking of sort of innovation of how to prevent collisions or how to mitigate against collisions, I think from my point of view, the innovation probably needs to be on the infrastructure rather than on the ships. As I mentioned, we've got a huge variety in the fleet. Even just on the Thames alone, you've got vessels that are 100 years old, you've got vessels that are a year old, so there's often little sort of opportunity to put innovation into the sort of basic fabric of the ship. If it's all gone really wrong and you've hit it really hard, survivability comes into play. By survivability, I'm talking about when the hull has been breached. So the structure and your prevention of trying to stop that happening. One of the best ways to make your ship more survivable is to subdivide it. So having a series of transverse bulkheads, dividing it into compartments, and therefore limiting the amount of flooding that can occur. A standard we would typically look for on a domestic passenger ship would be one compartment survivability. So that would be that a ship can survive with one compartment flooded. Collision bulkheads, we saw in the previous slide some of the typical structure. A collision bulkhead is a bulkhead towards the forward end of the ship. Essentially, anything in front of it you consider would be sort of lost in a head-on collision, but the collision bulkhead would prevent the rest of the ship being compromised. Stability in the damaged condition, it's all very well floating after your condition, but if you're floating at a sort of 45-degree angle or you're just about to capsize, then that's not providing a stable platform for evacuation or much use. So when we have a one compartment standard, a ship that meets that has to have a certain amount of stability in the damaged condition. I'll mention bilge pumping here. Bilge pumping, the ability to pump out water that's flooded into the ship, it's not something that we regulate to be relied on, so we tend to prefer the ship to have a sort of natural resistance to things. However, there have been collisions and groundings where the bilge pumping of a ship has allowed it to sort of, in fact, get back to port under its own steam, or allowed everybody to be evacuated. So it's important to sort of mention there that efficient bilge pumping can get you out of a lot of trouble, particularly if you're on an inland waterway and you haven't got that far to go, or you're quite, in fact, if you hit the pier, then you're pretty much by it. So pumping is quite a key thing. Inherent buoyancy. Some of our vessels, I mentioned we've got a sort of 7.5 metre passenger boat. Obviously, the amount of subdivision you can get in there is not great. So for that sort of vessel, you'd be looking at inherent buoyancy, so that even if it was flooded, it could still stay afloat. And really, the key here, as I've said, is evacuation. We're looking at being able to get people off. Again, because we're talking about sort of either sort of near coastal or inland waterways, time to rescue is not going to be days, and it's hopefully not even going to be hours. There was a grounding a couple of years ago, and I think the first boat was on the scene in about 6 minutes. So hopefully here we're not talking about a long time. I'll just give a note on fendering. You might have expected more of a focus, but from the perspective of sort of the ship's resistance to collision, fendering is almost a sort of last resort, and is almost controlled collision situations where we are talking about coming alongside or a mooring that's got slightly out of control. Obviously, the key with fendering is energy absorption. And preventing damage both to the ship and the infrastructure as well. So fendering is a very key and useful thing, but you do need to put it in the areas of high contact. So for the ship, you'd be looking at what the piers and wharves you'd be using on a regular basis, and the key areas where you might collide. But if you're sort of thinking about infrastructure that's not something that ships are going to come alongside, you've obviously got quite a lot of area where you might need fendering. There's two types of fendering on ships. There's mobile fenders and fixed fenders. So fixed fenders are sort of part of the ship's structure and remain in place at all times. Mobile fenders can be moved around. I've put a few examples on the next slide because I think it illustrates quite nicely how fendering is not always a terribly high-tech solution. These are actual passenger ships in UK waters. You can see we've got some tyres in one of them, and a mixture of sort of fixed fendering with additional mobile fenders, and I suppose you could say the tyres are more of a sacrificial fender. The bottom one, I think we've just about got everything on there. I'm not sure what they're thinking they're going to hit, but we've got some more maritime fenders on there, and just a sort of picture of this sort of typical D-type fendering that you would use on a ship. Obviously the dimensions depending on how much energy you need to absorb with your collisions. And with that, I will have another. Some of these pictures are, they're obviously not humorous because it's not good for the ship or the infrastructure, but you do wonder how that happened. Prevention of collision is the best defence. All the standards in the world aren't going to help if you can't sort of tackle the control and visibility and skills. I believe we're going to questions later, so I shall come and sit down.